this is one of those great titles, isn't it? Why Labour Fails. It's got a no-nonsense brevity about it, which I quite like, but it's quite a deep title in a way because it rolls. I think it rolls two key questions into one short phrase. And the first question is really this: it's what do we really mean when we say that Labour fails, for example? And the second question that flows directly out of that is the one that's more directly expressed in the title, which is if indeed Labour fails and keeps failing, why does it keep failing? And this in itself raises, I think, a deeper theoretical question, which is about the deep source of these failures. If Labour keeps failing, in other words, are these failures just circumstantial errors of its leadership and the policies it just happens to adopt? Or can we trace these failures to a deeper source, to the kind of political party that it, in fact, is? And that's the second question that I think we need to kind of address if we're going to try to deal with the question of why Labour fails. So to start off, this is the question: what do we mean when we say Labour fails? Well, in essence, if I can put it, probably start off by putting it in very simple terms, to which I think it all boils down to, it's this: that Labour fails the working class it was set up 120 years ago to represent. In essence, that's what we mean when we say Labour fails. It fails the class it was meant to represent. And I want to start by looking at the latest failure of Labour, the defeat of the Corbyn project within the Labour Party, and try to see what that starts to reveal about the Labour Party itself, so we can start to answer the second question as well as the first one. And we know, of course, Corbyn's election as leader, not just once, but twice with substantial majorities on both occasions, was, in terms of Labour Party history, quite unprecedented. And it was quite unprecedented, and it's odd to say it, but I think it's fair to say it, that Corbyn was elected as the most radical socialist leader the Labour Party has ever had. He was an anti-imperialist, a committed anti-imperialist who understood the value of campaigning outside Parliament against, as well as speaking obviously in Parliament. He was, of course, a lifetime anti-racist. He, like Tony Benn before him, in whose tradition he very much stands, these were socialists who understood that extra parliamentary movements were essential for political progress. In terms of policy, if I can summarize what Corbyn represented in policy terms, in general policy terms, domestically speaking, he represented the possibility of a serious break with 40 years of neoliberalism. On top of that, let's also not forget that he brought a mass of new members into the party. Under Miliband, the party membership was below 200,000. And this, under Corbyn's leadership, rose to over 500,000. In the 2017 general election, also, let's not forget, Labour's vote increased by 3 million, the largest increase since 1945 in its vote. And given all this, you'd think that the party would have been slapping Corbyn on the back and saying, well done, mate, keep up the good work, we're all behind you. But of course, that was not at all the situation. The opposite was the case. Apart from the greater part of the membership, which was pro-Corbyn, the main institutions of the party, from the local councillors to the Parliamentary Labour Party, to key members of the shadow cabinet, to the party machine with its general secretary at its head. They didn't just want Corbyn ousted from the leadership. They looked forward to the prospect of the party being defeated in the general election of 2017. And of course, even latterly in the recent election in 2019. We will all remember, I'm sure, the image of Stephen Kinnock looking as stunned as he was disappointed at Corbyn's general election success in 2017. His face said it all, I think. After 2017, of course, we know that these very institutions of the Labour Party worked hard to weaponize the question, the Remain question, as well as the anti-Semitism question against Jeremy Corbyn. And it has to be said, you know, let's be quite honest about this, they were successful, not least because, in part, of the failure of the Corbyn left to fight back, given the fact that they were effectively fighting with their hands behind their backs for the sake of party unity. And it hasn't ended there. We've now had the HRC report on anti-Semitism, we've had Corbyn's suspension, and it shows just how determined this party now is in terms of its institutional structures, the leadership that currently heads it, to effectively put the left of the Labour Party back in the box that the left has been in for those 40 years of neoliberalism, really, that we've endured, by effectively decapitating, this is what they're trying to do, decapitating the left by trying to destroy the political reputation of its key representative, its leader still, in the party. So the failure of the Corbyn project, in other words, its defeat, really does raise a key question. Why is it, how is it that there were so many in the hierarchy and the institutions of the Labour Party who were so determined to oust Corbyn from the leadership and even happy to see the party defeated in general elections? What does this tell us about the party itself? Does it enable us to draw some wider theoretical conclusions about what kind of political party it is? Well, that question, I think, can't be abstracted from the wider question of the party's history. It can't be abstracted, I think, from the history of the Blair governments. Everyone remembers from 1997 the enthusiasm with which almost 20 years of Tory rule ended. But no one, of course, can forget what followed. Of course, principally the terrible war on Iraq, but also the other military inventions against Serbia, for example, in Afghanistan, and in the Middle East more generally. Domestically, of course, the Blair government also took some steps which, frankly, the Tories would have been immensely proud of. They introduced tuition fees for students at universities, which have now crippled the generations of students with lifetime debt, essentially. The Blair governments were committed to the role of private capital in public projects, the whole private finance initiative idea, an idea that was started by John Major, a Tory Prime Minister in the early 1990s, and was brought to an end not by a Labour government, but by a Tory government in 2018. So the huge disappointments that have come as a result of the history of the Blair government is part and parcel of a wider level of disappointment that has been absolutely intrinsic to the history of the Labour Party. We can go back further to the other Wilson and Callaghan governments with their own particular disappointments. We can go back all the way to Ramsay MacDonald and the interwar governments as well. In particular, of course, the minority governments in the 20s, early 30s, and the second one of which ended absolutely catastrophically when the Labour cabinet voted in favour of cutting by 10%, not the income of the rich, but the unemployed benefit of the poorest to balance the budget during the Great Depression. This, of course, led to MacDonald in the end jumping ship, joining a national government with the Tories and others, and Labour going down to its worst ever election defeat, winning only 52 seats. So there's a whole history here. Of course, I'm sure that Labour Party members would jump up at this point and say to me, hang on a minute, we know all that, but of course we had that great moment, that great success in our history, the Attlee government of 1945 to 51. After all the horrors of the interwar period, which we accept, we put our hands up to that. Labour rose like a phoenix from the ashes, and here it was again in a radical reforming government during that post-war period. And yes, of course, this was the greatest moment in the history of the Labour Party, its greatest success, perhaps its only success in government, to be quite. But even in the time of its greatest success, even when we look at what the Labour government did, there is, at the same time, if we're going to take a balanced view of all this, we need to consider some of its failures too. If we take nationalisation, for example, the kind of nationalisation that the Labour Party implemented was a nationalisation that in many ways, by the appointment of state captains of industry, mimicked many of the relationships that are typical of private industry. They did not move 1 inch from the fundamental relationship between workers and employers that characterizes our society. If we take the NHS, for example, one of its great achievements, why is it that Aneurin Bevan resigned in 1951 in disgust at what? At the Labour government deciding to introduce prescription charges, dental charges, charges for spectacles. And we know now, where are we on this? Prescription charges still exist. That's a disgrace, in my opinion. Dental charges are, frankly, it costs an arm and a leg to get your teeth looked at these days, as everyone, I'm sure, knows, and spectacles cost a bloody fortune. These are effectively private medical sectors rather than part of a properly national health service. Finally, of course, so far as the Attlee government is concerned, let us remember that it was central to the formation of NATO. Let's also remember that the Attlee government, and Attlee himself in particular, played a particular role in the development of Britain's nuclear weaponry. He did that in secret. Only him and a handful of his cabinet, not even his entire cabinet, knew what he was up to. So in that history that we've seen here, we can see a pattern. I think we can see a pattern to all Labour's failures, including the failures that accompany its successes. And that's prioritizing bourgeois capitalist interests over working class interests. Now, is this, and this is, I think, goes back to the question I posed earlier, is this just a circumstantial problem with the leaders that Labour has happened to have, or the policies it has happened to have, or does it go deeper than that? And I think that is a key question for answering the issue we need to answer about why Labour fails. And I think, therefore, that the very brief analysis that was provided by Lenin way back in 1920 needs to be taken more seriously than it typically is, I think. Lenin himself had lived in London for a while. He read the British and Socialist press. He could read English and speak it very well. And his argument, the argument he put in 1920, was a very simple one and can be summarized in a very simple phrase. He said that Labour was a bourgeois workers' party. And that phrase carries a lot of meaning to it, because what he meant effectively was that Labour had been set up to represent workers, yes, but set up to represent workers within the limits of bourgeois society, but crucially not against those limits. And it's precisely because Labour has been committed from its very inception to working within those bourgeois limits that the limits of bourgeois society end up being the limits of the Labour Party itself. Those limits end up being part of the party's DNA itself. That's why, in the end, nation, for example, the national interest ends up being more important than class interest for the Labour Party. It's why Parliament ends up being always much more important than any movements or strikes outside Parliament. It's why it's always more important for the Labour Party in government to manage society rather than to change society. These aren't accidental features of the Labour Party. They're in its very bones. And that's, I think, the key meaning, the key significance of Lenin's phrase that Labour is a bourgeois workers' party. It's why, then, we can see why Corbyn, with his socialism and his anti-imperialism, had to be defeated precisely because he was pushing against the limits of the bourgeois society that the Labour Party is precisely committed to working within. It's precisely because of this that the representatives of the establishment, so to speak, in the Labour Party, most committed to those bourgeois limits, have done absolutely everything within their power to oust him. And this is why, therefore, the Labour Party has repeatedly failed, by which I mean repeatedly ended up choosing bourgeois interests over working class ones throughout its history. We all, of course, want Jeremy Corbyn to be reinstated. Achieving that will be in itself a victory if it is achieved. But the problem, I think, is that the Corbyn project was in reality a brief moment of light in an otherwise gloomy story. And it's a brief moment of light that has, in reality, which I think needs to be faced, been snuffed out by the establishment right of the Labour Party, who are always, in the end, able to muster the forces they need to get their own way within the Labour Party. When we therefore think about what the future kind of holds in this context, what we can see happening at the moment is a reflection of what Ramsay MacDonald once said in one of his more clear-sighted moments, I think. He once complained, and this was before he finally betrayed everything and jumped ship to form a national government in his more radical earlier days. He once complained that the Labour Party had become, in his opinion, a mere echo of the governing class. And Starmer's victory, in a way, means, as we can see every day in his daily practice, means echoing the ruling class rather than presenting an alternative to the ruling class. A very different view, therefore, of what we should be doing in these circumstances comes from a phrase that also Lenin used, which was about socialists being tribunes of the people. And there is therefore a rather sharp contrast to be drawn between being a tribune of the people and echoing the ruling class. Unfortunately, the Starmer leadership is interested above all else in echoing the ruling class. There's a choice there, a fundamental choice to be made, I think, between currently being an echo in the Labour Party under Starmer's leadership and being a tribune, or trying to be a tribune of the people outside the Labour Party. And I think that trying to be a tribune in the echo chamber of the Labour Party will be a lonely job in the years to come, even if Jeremy Corbyn is reinstated. It's not for me to tell people whether or not to stay in the Labour Party. You can see from the logic of my argument that I think it's better to leave. And I understand why many people will want to remain in the Labour Party. But I think remaining in the Labour Party means also understanding the very kind of political party that it really is. It means understanding its essence, its DNA, what's in its bones. And what's in its DNA, its bones, what its essence is that it is fundamentally a bourgeois way of trying to represent working class interests. But in that process, always giving way, giving priority to the bourgeois part of that phrase rather than the working class part of that phrase. Thanks very much.